Zhu Zilang said, "Immortal Master Shen, my apologies." "Don't! 1,000 times don't! I ended up in this sorry state because you wanted to thank me. Will I ever be able to get out of this alive if you started apologizing?" Just as these thoughts crossed his mind, Shen Qingqiu suddenly swayed, even though he had been walking just fine, and he had to brace himself on the stone wall for support. It felt like something was squirming and struggling, surging from his stomach to flood all the veins in his body. This sensation was both familiar and terrifying, and Shen Qingqiu nearly busted out a "motherfucker" on the spot. Luo Binghe was still sleeping in a coffin, so the stuff wreaking havoc in his body at this moment could only be someone else's blood. "Peak Lord, this can't be the first time you've drunk heavenly demon blood. How are you still not accustomed to it?" Tianlangjun asked. Shen Qingqiu forced back the urge to retch. "When did you make me drink it?" "Peak Lord Shen, don't forget, your immortal body was in our hands for no short amount of time," Tianlangjun replied, his words quite suggestive and teasing. "There's really too much we could have done." No wonder they had determined where he was heading so easily. Shen Qingqiu paused, then continued walking. The more he walked, the sharper the pain in his stomach grew, but he kept going faster and didn't slow down, partly because his pain tolerance had grown, but more so because he knew he absolutely couldn't fall to his knees now. While these two were still frozen, he had the chance to escape. By the time they defrosted, it would be no easy task to store them again. Though he was clear about the pros and cons here, as he walked faster and faster and Zhu Zilang spurred the blood into fiercer action, Shen Qingqiu couldn't resist turning to shoot a ferocious glare at him. He said he wanted to repay a kindness, so he was doing it by letting these blood mites nest, lay eggs, and enjoy a family reunion in Shen Qingqiu's stomach? To be able to walk so far even in this state, Peak Lord Shen must have an iron will, truly an extraordinary person, Tianlangjun remarked. Or should I say it's that you're willing to throw your life away for my son? Suddenly, Zhu Zilang said, "My lord, this subordinate can't suppress it any more." Before he had finished speaking, Shen Qingqiu felt the pain suddenly dissolve and his entire body went light. He immediately broke into a run. As he actually started running, Tianlangjun was quite surprised. "Can't your blood suppress him?" he asked. Zhu Zilang was greatly confused as well. "It could before, but for some reason, this time it can't." Shen Qingqiu's ears buzzed. He couldn't hear and his sight was blurred, but knowing he still had to drag Luo Binghe to the entrance and toss him out, he supported himself against the wall and started jogging. Tripping on something, his figure swayed. After forcing himself to hold on for so long, he was nearing his body's limits and on the verge of collapse. His knees immediately went soft. However, he didn't fall to the ground and found himself caught solidly by someone's arm, then was half supported, half lifted to his feet. With his vision a blur and the world spinning around him, Shen Qingqiu's gaze focused upward. In the murky darkness of the stone corridor, it was impossible to see the person's face. But a pair of eyes, burning with fury and a mark shining with scarlet light, shone clearly through the gloom. Tianlangjun and Zhu Zilang were now frozen from head to toe, two eye sculptures coiled with dark qi standing in the center of the hall. After Luo Binghe strode into the hall, threads of ice-cold white qi crawled up his black boots, but he mercilessly stomped them to pieces. He slammed a palm into each of the ice sculptures, and cracks snaked along the surface of the solid ice. "It's no use," Shen Qingqiu said, half leaning against the stone wall. "Crystallized ice isn't so easy to break after it's formed, and attacking it like that can't harm the ones inside. We might as well take advantage of this opportunity to escape the holy mausoleum while they sealed." Luo Binghe whipped around and walked towards Shen Qingqiu again. When he had first seen Luo Binghe, Shen Qingqiu had been both surprised and happy. He had planned to go back to the coffin to fetch him, not expecting that he'd wake up himself. He was just about to ask how Luo Binghe was feeling when he realized that Luo Binghe seemed to be furious. "Didn't I tell you not to associate with them?" Luo Binghe snapped. He spoke in nearly a roar. Shen Qingqiu was already dizzy, and now his eardrums ached at the volume of Luo Binghe's voice. It was like someone had thrown a basin of cold water in his face. After staring blankly for a moment, he suddenly felt an inexplicable flame of anger erupt within his heart. He said dryly, "Are you better now?" "Better? Better how?" Luo Binghe's tone was still unkind. If he was that full of vitality, he was probably fine. That being the case, Shen Qingqiu had managed to repay Luo Binghe at least a little bit. He nodded. "That's good." Then he turned, picked a random direction, and walked off. Actually, he didn't know where he ought to go. If he wanted to leave the Holy Mausoleum, Xingmo Sword and Luo Binghe were both indispensable. Without either, he could only blindly wander around inside. But he staked his damn life to drag Luo Binghe all this way and just being yelled at for his troubles. Staying there to sulk would be pointless too. Before he'd gotten very far, a last breath candle on the side of the corridor blazed with light, and the dim candlelight illuminated one side of his face. Luo Binghe suddenly reached out and caught his arm. "Are you crying?" Shen Qingqiu froze. Was he crying? Was he crying? Not possible! Shen Qingqiu wiped at his cheek with his left hand. This perfectly uninjured hand had kept a firm hold on Luo Binghe the whole time, only now was it free to do other things. As soon as he touched his face, he realized that at some point, tears had indeed streamed down his cheeks. Shen Qingqiu was abruptly aware that these were the tears of pain he had cried while pulling the ties that bind from his leg. How unsightly. Luo Binghe's anger disappeared from his voice without a trace. "So earlier, when I heard the faint sounds of Shizun crying, that was real?" he asked, tone urgent. "What crying?" Shen Qingqiu snapped, lashing out somewhat in embarrassment. "I don't know anything about that." He tried to walk right off again, but Luo Binghe hurriedly embraced him from behind, and just so managed to grab Shen Qingqiu's right arm where the ties that bind had taken root. Shen Qingqiu managed to not shriek, but he still let out a stifled groan. Luo Binghe immediately let go and led him over by the left hand to inspect him under the candlelight. The more Luo Binghe looked, the more shocked he became. Practically no place on Shen Qingqiu's body was safe to look at. He was nothing but a heap of wounds and blood, truly a spectacle too horrible to behold. Luo Binghe remembered that before he had lost consciousness, Shen Qingqiu had clearly still been in perfect condition. His voice trembled. "This was all for me?" Shen Qingqiu was going to spit blood. If not for Luo Binghe, then who? He couldn't say that sort of thing. He always felt awkward about making a big deal about what he'd done for someone else or showing off his scars, and he only managed to wrench out 4 words. "Your hand, let go." Luo Binghe changed his expression in the blink of an eye and softened. I won't, Shizun. Don't be angry. I was wrong. Oh my God, he said that so many times. Shen Qingqiu waved him aside. Hurry up and go. The blind corpses are surrounding us already. Why are we still here blocking the road? He thought. Having been waved off, Luo Binghe latched onto him again like sticky cowhide candy, impossible to pry off. Shizun, why don't you hit me? You can beat me up to vent your anger. Help! There's a masochist over here. Someone come lock him up. Shen Qingqiu flew down the corridor, and Luo Binghe stuck to him the whole way. He was most familiar with Luo Binghe's act by now. Luo Binghe knew very well that he responded to sweetness rather than to threats. After a long while of being pestered and worn down, Shen Qingqiu said helplessly, You're always like this, crying and admitting your wrongs, but you never change. What's the point? At this point, Luo Binghe was close to sobbing. I'll change, all right. Shizun, don't abandon me. The sight of him acting like such a good-for-nothing was such that, if Shen Qingqiu hadn't still been concerned about the bumps he had left on the back of Luo Binghe's skull, he'd have filled that with the urge to give him a few smacks on the head. There was nothing wrong with his teaching methods, was there? How had he raised such a crybaby? What would everyone say if they knew the devil incarnate Luo Binghe liked to hang onto his Shizun's sleeve and wail when no one else was around? Who'd fucking believe it? Not even Ning Ying cried this much. Shen Qingqiu couldn't take it anymore. Who's abandoned you? Huh? After I lost consciousness, I still retained a shred of awareness. I was fighting with all my might to wake up, Luo Binghe said. But once I finally managed to wake, I found myself lying in a coffin, and Shizun had run off to who knew where. I snapped. I thought I'd been abandoned. I thought Shizun would rather run off with those two than pay attention to me. Waking up to find yourself all alone, quote, abandoned in a coffin, that certainly wouldn't feel very good. Shen Qingqiu guiltily coughed. Just now, I didn't do that on purpose, Luo Binghe continued. I don't even know why I did it. I didn't want to, and I didn't want to say those things, but I could never control myself in front of Shizun. I know I've been embarrassing and unsightly, but knowing that Shizun didn't abandon me, that he was protecting me all along, that I wasn't dreaming, I was so happy. Exactly which one of us is being embarrassing and unsightly here? Two grown men entangled in a heap, wiping our tears and snot. We're both being embarrassing and unsightly, okay? Perhaps because he was too happy, Luo Binghe was now unable to utter any of his flowery vocabulary. He just kept repeating the words, quote, happy and glad, over and over in those simple terms. Shen Qingqiu's face twitched. Rubbing his temples, he let out a deep sigh. Whatever. It wasn't like this was the first time. Even when Menmo had said that this kid was just like this, acting all badass dark and demon lord to your face. But who knew if he was wringing his handkerchief and crying behind your back? What use was it to hold that against him? Getting back to the point, Shen Qingqiu himself had been ridiculous too. Getting upset over such a small misunderstanding. He was no better than his unfortunate lunatic child. How unlike a proper elder. He caught his breath for a moment. You really all right now? He asked. Luo Binghe immediately nodded. I'm all right. He had had such a high fever, and now he was perfectly fine. Shen Qingqiu was quite skeptical and pressed a hand to Luo Binghe's forehead, but he found it cool and smooth. He tried to take his hand away, but Luo Binghe covered it with his own, refusing to let him move, eyes shining below their folded palms. This expression was too familiar. Wasn't this that good and upright youth, that bleating, grass-chewing little lamb who had followed Shen Qingqiu around every day on Qingjing Peak? That small, refreshing son of a Luo Binghe? Shen Qingqiu's face was going to turn red under his stare, but he couldn't just tear his hand away. If he did that while Luo Binghe was all excited and overjoyed, how would that be any different from slapping him across the face? "So you're really completely fine?" Shen Qingqiu asked. "No dizziness? Your spiritual and demonic energy are circulating well?" "Quite well," said Luo Binghe. "Very well, even better than before." As they spoke, they had reached a chamber on the east end of the mausoleum. Luo Binghe drew his sword and slashed, and a pitch-black spatial rift appeared in the screen wall. His broken arm had mysteriously healed itself. He was no longer limping. The blood on his face had been wiped clean, and the ever-disobedient Xingmo sword was docile in his hands. The protagonist was still the protagonist, as OP as ever. Shen Qingqiu didn't want to say another word. With a quote, "let's go" type of gesture, he led the way through the rift. Outside the mausoleum, it was a bright and sunny day. Luo Binghe reached out to support Shen Qingqiu and prompted. Come to think of it, it really had been a long time since they had such a normal interaction. As soon as Shen Qingqiu had this melancholic thought, he couldn't resist shooting a glance at Luo Binghe. Seeing him all upbeat and refreshed, it really did seem like he was, quote, quite well. Funny how Shen Qingqiu had staked his sorry life to protect Luo Binghe, and all that trouble slid off him like water off a duck's back. Turned out all this time he'd spent snoozing away was to recharge his OP halo. Shen Qingqiu waved goodbye to his own dignity. Luo Binghe suddenly said, "But other than hearing Shi Zun crying..." Shen Qingqiu smiled faintly. Who was crying?" Luo Binghe immediately changed his tone. Other than hearing someone crying, I also had this strange feeling." At this, Shen Qingqiu grew a bit worried again. So he really did have some lingering symptoms? He said quietly, "What sort of feeling?" Luo Binghe shook his head. "I can't say." "Did it hurt?" "It didn't hurt. It was very..." Before he could finish, a confused expression crossed his face, and he looked down at his lower body. Shen Qingqiu was silent. "Hello, Heavenly Pillar! Goodbye, Heavenly Pillar!" This conversation was halted before it could continue. Tianlangjuin's voice drifted after them like a deceased soul, refusing to disperse. "Peak Lord Shen, why are you in such a hurry to leave? The two of you have all but overturned my race's sacred land. How can you just simply walk out like this without leaving anything behind?" With every word, Tianlangjuin's voice grew much closer. Before long, he appeared within sight. The Mobei clan's ice magic, which had clung to their tomb for millennia, had managed to delay Tianlangjuin and Zhuo Zilang until Shen Qingqiu and Luo Binghe left the holy mausoleum. It had truly done a lot. Luo Binghe was already displeased that he had been unable to simply shatter those two into ice shards earlier, and their choice to deliver themselves to him quite suited his wishes. His knuckles cracking, he glared at Zhuo Zilang, his voice taking on a dangerous tone. "You dare to feed my Shi Zun your blood?" As soon as Zhuo Zilang saw Shen Qingqiu, an abashed expression crossed his face. Tianlangjuin looked at Luo Binghe, then sighed. You can't say those words with that sort of expression. Didn't you also feed Peak Lord Shen your blood? Or does that other set of blood mites in Peak Lord Shen's body belong to someone else? Upon hearing this, Luo Binghe froze, and his fists clenched tight. As soon as Shen Qingqiu began to lift the hand holding Xiuya's sword, Luo Binghe immediately said quietly, Shizun doesn't need to fight. I'm enough on my own. And they were off. 3 pillars of dark qi soared, churning into the sky like storm winds. Watching the battle as a spectator, Shen Qingqiu was even more deeply appreciative of how demons and humans were inarguably 2 different races. The difference in destructive potential was really too profound. And it looked like Luo Binghe had indeed just been recharging and upgrading his OP halo. A mere couple of hours prior, he had been viciously beaten up, powerless to fight, but now he looked like the protagonist's halo was still solidly affixed to Luo Binghe's head after all. As Shen Qingqiu watched, he noticed a scarlet bone eagle circling through the air, lowering its wings and looking for an opportunity to rush into the fray. As Luo Binghe fought 1-on-2, it seemed he hadn't noticed this bone eagle that obviously harbored nefarious intentions, but Shen Qingqiu could see everything clearly. Just as he was about to call out a warning, that bone eagle swooped and dove at the top of Luo Binghe's head. A sneak attack? Shen Qingqiu held Xiuya's sword in a reverse grip, took careful aim, and flung it at his target. The snow-white blade flew like an arrow, running the bone eagle through like a bolt of lightning. But before Shen Qingqiu could breathe a sigh of relief, he saw that the bone eagle's body didn't fall, but scattered into thousands upon thousands of droplets, which surged towards him. Tianlangjun suddenly drew back and hopped away from the battle with a laugh. As a blood droplet scattered through the air, a stricken expression flashed across Luo Binghe's face. Shen Qingqiu immediately realized that Tianlangjun had solidified his own blood to create this bone eagle. He had sent the bone eagle to ambush Luo Binghe, but his true intent had been to draw Shen Qingqiu into attacking and shooting it down. Just as Shen Qingqiu realized this, he received a downpour of bloody rain to the face. Tianlangjun smiled faintly. He raised his hand, then made a fist in midair. Shen Qingqiu immediately felt his heart clench, as if it were now in someone's palm, being kneaded and pinched maliciously. There was just too much blood. Though he had shut his mouth tight, he still tasted a hint of rust on his tongue. Who else guzzled heavenly demon blood like Red Bull? Who else had drunk the blood of 3 different heavenly demons? Luo Binghe's eyes were red with panic, but Tianlangjun's blood were inside Shen Qingqiu's body, so he didn't dare do anything rash, afraid Tianlangjun would unleash the blood mites. He could only grit his teeth and yell, "Stop!" Watching Shen Qingqiu's face go green and pale in turns, Zhu Zilang couldn't resist speaking up. "My lord, show some mercy." Tianlangjun shrugged. "That depends on what our other young friend will do next."